I felt it in my bones before the alarms ever sounded. It was the 13th hour of my shift at the Manufactorum Delta 79, where I operated drill press number 4206, stamping out the same component I had stamped for the last 11 years. My hands moved with the automaticity of prayer, pulling the lever, watching the hydraulic ram descend, hearing the satisfying crunch of shaped metal. The rhythm was everything. The rhythm was survival. Break the rhythm and the overseers noticed you, and when the overseers noticed you, your name went into ledgers that were never good for your health. But then came the shudder. It traveled up through the rockcrete floor, through the soles of my worn industrial boots, through the bones of my feet and ankles and up my spine until it rattled my teeth. The drill press shivered in sympathy, its ancient frame groaning like an old man disturbed from sleep. Around me, 200 other workers paused, just for a heartbeat, just long enough to exchange glances that said, "Did you feel that?" Before the crack of a shock maul against a workbench brought us back to our duty. "Maintain production." Overseer Kelk's voice was amplified through the vox horns mounted on the factory pillars, distorted and crackling with interference. "The Emperor's work does not pause for tremors. Any worker who disrupts the quota will be marked for corrective labor." We returned to our stations because that's what you did. That's what you always did. The Imperium of man was built on 10,000 years of men and women returning to their stations, swallowing their fear and pulling the lever one more time. The drill press descended. The component was stamped. The rhythm resumed. But I had felt it. We had all felt it. The Factorum sirens began to wail perhaps 20 minutes later, a discordant chorus of different tones and pitches, each one installed in a different era by a different administrator who never consulted the previous systems. Some were ancient air raid warnings from wars fought before my grandfather's grandfather drew breath. Others were newer, shrill digital things that made your ears ring and your head ache. Together they created a cacophony that was almost religious in its assault on the senses, a mechanical hymn to disaster. Dust began to rain from the ceiling. I looked up and watched it fall through the harsh lumen light, particles dancing and swirling like ash from a promethium fire. The ceiling of Manufactorum Delta 79 was 40 meters above us, lost in shadows and the accumulated grime of centuries. The support girders up there were original construction, dating back to the Hive's founding in M37. I'd heard older workers say that if you looked carefully, you could still see the maker's marks from the foundries of old Terra herself, though I'd never been high enough to verify that claim. Now those ancient girders were shedding dust like dead skin. "Remain at your posts," the vox horns crackled again, and I recognized the strained edge in Kelk's voice now. He was afraid. 20 years I'd worked under that bastard supervision, weathering his casual cruelties and arbitrary punishments, and I'd never heard fear in his voice before. "The Administratum has issued a general advisory. Minor subsidence in the underhive levels. Structural integrity remains optimal. Maintain production quotas. The Emperor protects." The Emperor protects. That phrase was supposed to bring comfort, I think. It was stamped on every wall, etched into every door, whispered in every prayer. But standing there with dust in my hair and an ancient tremor echoing in my bones, it felt less like reassurance and more like a threat. The Emperor protects, yes, but the Emperor has a galaxy to manage, and you're just one worker at one drill press in one manufactorum in one hive city on one world among millions. The math doesn't favor you. The second tremor came an hour later, and this time there was no ignoring it. The entire manufactorum floor lurched beneath our feet like the deck of a ship in a storm. The drill press swayed, its bolts screaming against the rockcrete. Someone across the floor lost their balance and fell into their machine. I heard the wet crunch and the abbreviated scream before their station's emergency cutoff engaged. The lights flickered, and for one terrible moment we were plunged into darkness broken only by the red emergency lumens that clicked on with a sound like breaking bones. In that crimson half-light, I saw Overseer Kelk clearly for the first time. He stood on his elevated platform, one hand gripping the railing, his shock maul hanging forgotten at his belt. His face was pale, eyes wide, and I realized with a sick sort of satisfaction that he knew something we didn't. Something bad enough to make a man who dealt in casual brutality look like a frightened child. The lights stuttered back to full power, but the damage was done. The rhythm was broken. Workers were talking now, muttering to each other despite the standing order of silence. Questions rippled through the factory floor like waves. What was that? Is it the Underhive? Are we under attack? Should we evacuate? Kelk's voice boomed through the vox horns, artificially loud and artificially confident. Return to your stations. The tremor has passed. Production must continue. Any worker who abandons their post will be... His voice cut off mid-sentence. Someone must have overridden the Vox system from higher up the chain of command, because suddenly we were hearing a different voice. Mechanical, feminine, the recorded tones of an administratum servitor reading from a prepared script. Attention all manufactorum personnel. Minor seismic event detected in lower Hive sectors 12 through 18. Structural integrity remains within acceptable parameters. All workers are to remain at their posts and maintain standard production quotas. Ration distribution will proceed as scheduled. Water reclamation systems are functioning normally. The planetary governor assures all citizens that this event is routine geological adjustment consistent with Hive. City settlement patterns the Emperor protects. Compliance is mandatory. Message repeats. The message did repeat, looping over and over while we stood frozen at our stations. Routine geological adjustment. I turned that phrase over in my mind, testing it for truth. The Hive was old, impossibly old by human standards. And yes, it settled. Entire sections would sometimes sink a few centimeters as the ancient foundations compressed under the weight of millennia. But that's not what I had felt. What I had felt was wrong at a fundamental level, like the city itself was in pain. I returned to my drill press because what else was there to do? The lever felt cold in my hand despite the manufactorum's heat. I pulled it, watched the ram descend, heard the crunch of metal. The component fell into the collection bin with a tinny rattle. I reached for the next blank slug of raw metal and loaded it into position. Pull the lever. Stamp the component, collect the result. Repeat. This was my life. This had always been my life. I was born in Hab Block 97, level 214 in the Mid-Hive. My mother worked in a textile factory until her lungs gave out from breathing lint and chemical fumes. My father I never knew. Lost in the Hive somewhere. Another anonymous face in billions. I learned to read just enough to understand work orders and warning signs. I learned to pray just enough to avoid attention from the ecclesiarchy enforcers. And I learned to work the drill press because that's what you did when you were 12 years old and the administratum assigned you to the manufactorum. 33 years. 33 years of the same rhythm, the same motion, the same prayer of metal on metal. And now the city was trembling. The shift ended at the 18th hour, though ended might be generous. The overseers herded us toward the exit gates like livestock, counting heads against their data slates, making marks when someone was missing or injured. The worker who'd fallen into their machine during the second tremor was gone, dragged off by the sanitation servitors probably. Their station already had a new worker assigned to it, a young girl who couldn't have been more than 14, looking terrified and trying not to show it. The streets outside were chaos. I'd expected crowds, You always got crowds during shift changes, thousands of workers flowing from one manufactorum to another, to the hab blocks, to the ration distribution centers. But this was different. This was panic barely restrained by habit and fear of the Arbites. People moved too quickly, talked too loudly, looked around with eyes that darted and searched for danger they couldn't name. The tremors had been felt everywhere, I realized. The entire hive had shuddered. I joined the flow of humanity moving toward the transit lifts that would take me up 3 levels to my hab block. The crowd pressed in around me, a mass of unwashed bodies and stale breath and the particular smell of people who work with machinery, oil and metal and sweat and fear. Someone stepped on my foot. Someone else's elbow dug into my ribs. The crowd had a momentum of its own now, a current that swept you along whether you wanted to go or not. The first Voxcaster I passed was mounted on a pillar at the intersection of 2 major thoroughfares, surrounded by a small crowd of people straining to hear. Remain calm and proceed to your assigned hab units in an orderly fashion. The recent seismic events are under investigation by the appropriate authorities. All transit systems are operating normally. Food distribution will... Static swallowed the rest of the message, and the crowd groaned in frustration. "It's the Underhive," someone near me said. A man with the hunched posture of a spinal injury poorly treated. "My cousin's boy works in the water reclamation down in Sector 15. Says whole sections have gone dark. Says there's been cave-ins." "Cave-ins happen all the time down there," another voice countered, a woman this time. "The Underhive's been falling apart since before our great-grandparents. It's not." The third tremor hit. This one was stronger than the first 2 combined. The street buckled beneath my feet, throwing me to my knees. Around me, thousands of people screamed and fell and clutched at walls and pillars and each other. The Voxcaster exploded in a shower of sparks, its speaker voice cutting off mid-word. The lumens overhead flickered in a pattern that had no rhythm, no sense, on, off, like the beating of a dying heart. I stayed on my knees, hands pressed against the rockcrete, feeling the city shake. It went on for 10 seconds, 20, half a minute. Somewhere in the distance I heard the groan of metal under stress, the crack of breaking stone, the crash of something massive giving way. Screams rose and fell like sirens, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the tremor itself. It was the silence of people holding their breath, waiting for the next blow, waiting for the ceiling to come down or the floor to open up or some other catastrophe to manifest. In that silence I heard a sound I'd never heard before in all my years in the Hive. The emergency klaxons of the Arbites' fortress precinct, wailing their alarm across the entire level. I looked up at the ceiling, at the ancient rockcrete and steel that had stood for 10,000 years. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, spreading as I watched, dust raining down in steady streams. Someone near me started to pray, voice high and reedy. "The Emperor protects, the Emperor protects, the Emperor protects." Others joined in, a ragged chorus of desperate faith. But I didn't pray. I thought about Overseer Kelk's frightened eyes. I thought about the Voxcaster's mechanical reassurances that looped even as the city fell apart. I thought about 33 years of pulling a lever and stamping components day after day, year after year, because that's what you did. That's what you always did. And I felt, deep in my bones where the first tremor had settled like an ache, that something fundamental had broken. Not just in the Hive's structure, but in the great machine of Imperial bureaucracy that kept us all in our places. Pulling our levers, stamping our components, maintaining our rhythms. The city was dying, and it was going to take us all with it. By the third day, entire sections of the lower Hive had gone dark. I knew this not because the administratum told us. The official Voxcast still proclaimed that everything was under control, that the tremors were routine, that production must continue. But because of the refugees, they came up from the depths like drowning men breaking the surface of water, wild-eyed and filthy and desperate. They filled the streets and the markets and the transit stations, carrying whatever they could grab in the minutes before their hab blocks had been evacuated or collapsed or simply cut off from power and water. I saw them from my place in the ration queue on the morning of the third day, a line that had taken 4 hours to move 50 meters. The queue snaked through the market district of level 214, past shuttered stalls and shops whose owners had decided that whatever goods they had were worth more kept than sold. The crowd pressed in around me, workers from my manufacturum, families from neighboring hab blocks, and now these refugees from below, their presence marked by the extra layers of desperation in their faces. They're saying sectors 12 through 21 are completely gone, the woman behind me whispered. She was old, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that comes from a lifetime of hive living. Collapsed into the deep underhive, millions dead, just gone. The Vox says it's under control, I replied, though I didn't believe it any more than she did. The Vox lies. She said it so matter-of-factly that it took me a moment to register the heresy of the statement. To question the official pronouncements of the administratum was to question the Imperium itself. People disappeared for less, but she was old, and the city was shaking itself apart, and maybe at a certain point the rules stopped mattering. The ration center was a squat rockcrete building that had been ancient when my grandparents were young. Its walls were covered in the usual Imperial iconography, aquilus and skulls and purity seals, but also in layers of graffiti that the Arbites had given up trying to scrub away years ago. The queue led to a single window where an exhausted-looking administrator checked identification chips against a data slate before dispensing that day's allotment. A kilogram of corpse starch formed into vaguely bread-like bricks, a liter of reclaimed water in a recycled plastic container, and a small packet of vitamin supplements that were probably older than I was. It wasn't much. It was never much. But it was survival. The tremor hit while I was 20 people from the window, not as strong as the third one had been, but sustained. A low vibration that went on, making my teeth ache and my stomach churn. The building groaned around us. Dust fell from the ceiling. Someone in the queue screamed, and suddenly everyone was pushing, shoving, desperate to get inside or get away. I couldn't tell which. The crowd became a mob in seconds, all pretense of order evaporating like morning mist. I held my ground, or tried to. An elbow caught me in the ribs. Someone's boot came down on my foot hard enough to make me gasp. The old woman behind me fell, and I grabbed her arm instinctively, hauling her upright before the crowd could trample her. She looked at me with gratitude and terror in equal measure. The window slammed shut with a bang that cut through the chaos. "Ration distribution suspended," a voice boomed from a voxcaster mounted above the door. "Return to your hab units. Await further instructions." The crowd roared its displeasure, but we were already being pushed back by Arbites in full riot gear, their carapace armor painted in the black and red of the Adeptus Arbites, their shock mauls crackling with barely restrained violence. They formed a line, shields locked, advancing with mechanical precision. Behind them came the shotguns, aimed not at us but above us, a warning that needed no translation. I retreated with the rest of the crowd, hungry and angry and afraid. The transit lift station was worse. I'd gone there without really thinking, some dim instinct saying that up was good, that the higher levels might be safer, that maybe if I could just get far enough from the source of the tremors, I could find stability. Thousands of others had the same idea. The station was packed with humanity in a way I'd never seen before, bodies pressed so tight you could barely breathe, the air thick with sweat and panic and the particular smell of fear. The Arbites had set up barricades at the lift entrances, turning back everyone who approached with shock mauls and shouted orders. I watched from the edge of the crowd as a family, mother, father, 3 children, tried to push through. The father argued with the Arbites, gesticulating wildly, pointing at his children. The mother held a baby, couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in dirty cloth. The Arbites didn't budge. "Evacuation transports are coming," one of them said, voice flat and mechanical through his helmet's Vox grill. "Return to your HAB units. Await proper authorization. Unauthorized use of transit systems is strictly forbidden by order of the planetary governor." "We have authorization," the father shouted, waving what looked like a data slate. "I'm an administrator in the Water Reclamation Division. Essential personnel. We have clearance." The shock maul caught him across the chest, dropping him instantly. The mother screamed. The children cried. The Arbites stepped forward and the crowd surged back, and I found myself carried away by the current of bodies, unable to help even if I'd wanted to. Essential personnel. I'd heard those words before. They meant that some people mattered more than others, that some lives were worth saving while the rest of us were expendable cogs in a machine that was grinding itself to pieces. I made it back to my HAB block as the sun was setting. Not that we could see the sun this deep in the Hive, but the chronos built into every street corner said it was the 20th hour, and habit was stronger than reality. The HAB block was a tower within a tower, one of hundreds of identical structures that housed the mid-Hive's working population. My unit was on the 73rd floor, a room 3 meters by 4 meters that contained everything I owned. A sleeping pallet, a small shrine to the Emperor, mandatory, a locker for my clothes and identification papers, and a water reclamation unit that gurgled and spat but usually worked. The lift was broken. It had been broken for 2 days, ever since the first major tremor. I climbed the stairs, joining a stream of exhausted workers making the same journey. My legs burned. My lungs ached. By the time I reached my floor, I was shaking with fatigue. The door to my unit was already open. I stopped in the corridor, staring at it. I'd locked it that morning. I always locked it. In a Hive city, an unlocked door was an invitation to lose everything you had. But the door hung ajar now, swaying slightly on its hinges, and I could see that the frame had been forced, the locking mechanism bent and broken. I pushed it open slowly, half expecting to find thieves or squatters or worse. Instead, I found a family. They were in the corner of my HAB, huddled together on my sleeping pallet, a man, a woman, 2 children. The man looked up as I entered, his face a mask of desperate defiance. He was younger than me, maybe 25, with the build of someone who worked with their hands. The woman held one of the children, a boy of perhaps 5. The other child, a girl, clung to her father's leg. "Please," the man said, his voice hoarse. "Please, we just need a place to stay. Just for tonight. Our HAB collapsed. We lost everything. I can work, I can pay you, just please." I should have thrown them out. It was my HAB unit. I'd earned it through 33 years of loyal service to the manufactorum. They were trespassers, squatters, taking what wasn't theirs. But I looked at the children's faces, hollow-eyed and streaked with dirt, and I thought about the family I'd seen at the transit station. The mother with her baby, the father struck down by an Arbite's shock maul. "One night," I heard myself say. "Tomorrow you find somewhere else." The relief in his face was almost painful to see. "Thank you. Emperor bless you. Thank you." I moved to the small ledge that served as my kitchen area and divided my rations into 5 portions instead of 1. The corpse starch had never seemed so inadequate. The children ate like they were starving, which they probably were. The adults tried to maintain dignity, eating slowly, but I could see the hunger in their eyes. "Where are you from?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Sector 17, the man said. "Mid-lower Hive. I worked in the atmospheric processors. 3 days ago there was a collapse, not our sector but close. The vibrations must have weakened everything around it. Yesterday our whole block started to tilt. We could feel the floor sloping under our feet. The Arbites came through and told us to evacuate, said transports were coming." He laughed bitterly. "But the transports never came, and when we tried to use the transit lifts, they turned us away. Said we didn't have authorization. So we climbed. We've been climbing for 2 days. How far down were you?" "Level 47. I did the math in my head. They'd climbed over 150 levels, carrying children with no food and probably no water. The human body was capable of remarkable things when survival was at stake." "The wealthy already left," the woman said suddenly, her voice bitter. "Did you see? At the beginning, when the first tremors hit. The nobles and the merchants and the administrators, they all had private lighters. Just took off from their spire mansions and flew to the orbital stations. Left the rest of us to die. I had seen it, though I hadn't let myself think about it too much. On the first day, the sky above the Hive had been filled with ascending craft. Sleek private vessels with the heraldry of noble houses, cargo haulers stuffed with possessions, even a few administratum shuttles. Like rats abandoning carrion, as the saying went. The rich always had options. The rest of us had orders to remain at our posts and await instructions. That night, I gave the family my sleeping pallet and made a bed for myself on the floor using my spare work coveralls as a blanket. It was uncomfortable, but no more so than many other nights I'd endured. The hab block was never silent. You could always hear your neighbors through the thin walls, the groans of the structure, the hum of the recycling systems. But tonight the sounds were different, louder, more desperate. I heard crying from the unit next door, shouting from somewhere above, the crash of breaking furniture from below. The city was eating itself from within. The tremors came every few hours now, irregular and unpredictable. Some were small, barely noticeable. Others were strong enough to make the entire hab block sway like a tree in the wind. I lay on my floor and felt them through the rockcrete. Each one a reminder that the foundations of our world were coming apart. Around midnight, the voxcaster in the corridor outside crackled to life with another message from the administratum. All citizens are advised to remain in their assigned hab units. Do not attempt to use transit systems without proper authorization. Evacuation procedures are being implemented in an orderly fashion according to established protocols. Food and water distribution will resume at dawn. The planetary governor assures all loyal citizens that the situation is under control. Maintain your faith in the Emperor. Compliance is mandatory. Message repeats. "They're lying," the man from Sector 17 said from the darkness. "There is no orderly evacuation. There are no transports coming. They're just trying to keep us calm while they figure out what to do." "Or while they escape," his wife added. I didn't disagree with them. I'd lived in the Imperium long enough to know that the machine of bureaucracy ground slowly and that individual lives were less important than maintaining order. How many millions lived in this hive? 10 billion? 20? More? Even if they wanted to evacuate everyone, where would we go? How many ships would it take to move that many people? How long would it take to organize such an effort? No. We were on our own. We had always been on our own. The tremor that came in the deepest part of the night was different from the others. Not stronger necessarily, but sustained. It started as a low vibration that I felt through my spine, a thrumming that went on and on without stopping. The entire hab block groaned, metal and stone crying out in voices that shouldn't exist. I sat up in the darkness, my heart hammering, and heard the family on my sleeping pallet doing the same. And then, from somewhere far below, so far below it might have been the Underhive itself, or even deeper in the ancient foundations that reached down to bedrock, came a sound like thunder. But not thunder, bigger than thunder, more fundamental. It was the sound of the city itself breaking, of millions of tons of structure giving way all at once, of the great machine finally failing under its own weight. The vibration stopped. The sound faded. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The distant roar of mob violence, rising up from the levels below like the voice of some vast and hungry beast, screaming, crashing. The pop, pop, pop of gunfire. The city wasn't just breaking physically, it was breaking socially, the thin veneer of order that kept billions of people from each other's throats finally cracking under the pressure of fear and hunger and desperation. "What's happening?" the girl asked, her voice small in the darkness. "It's going to be okay," her mother lied, pulling both children close. "The Emperor protects." But I knew, and I think we all knew, that whatever protection the Emperor offered, it was abstract and distant and measured in the survival of the species rather than the individual. We were just numbers in a ledger, entries in a census, cogs in a machine, and when the machine broke down, the cogs were discarded. I went to my small window, a narrow slit in the rockcrete that looked out over the interior of the hive, and pressed my face against the grimy plasteel. Below me, stretching down into darkness, I could see the lights of 1,000 hab blocks, 1 billion windows, each one representing a life or a family or a hope or a fear. Some of the lights were flickering, some had gone dark entirely. And as I watched, I saw fire blooming in the depths, small at first, then spreading, a flower of orange and red that grew and grew. The hive was burning, and we were still inside. When the main power relays failed, we were plunged into a blackness so complete it felt like being buried alive. It happened on the morning of the 5th day, though calling it morning was an abstraction now, since we hadn't seen actual sunlight in the hab blocks for as long as I'd been alive. Time was measured by chronos and shift changes and the artificial cycles of lumen light that mimicked a day we'd never experienced. But that morning, at what should have been the 6th hour, the light simply stopped. Not flickered, not dimmed, just stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch and cut power to our entire section of the hive. The darkness was total, absolute, the kind of darkness that makes you doubt your own eyes, makes you wave your hand in front of your face just to confirm you still have a hand. I'd experienced power outages before. They were common enough in a structure this old. But those had always been localized, temporary, fixed within hours by the tech priests who maintained the ancient systems. This felt different. This felt permanent. I was in my hab unit when it happened, preparing for another day at the manufactorum. The family from Sector 17 was gone. They'd left before dawn, whispering thanks and apologies, heading off to find their own shelter, or perhaps to keep climbing toward levels they imagined might be safer. I'd given them half my remaining rations and told myself I'd done my duty to the Emperor's commandment, to show mercy to the unfortunate. The darkness swallowed me mid-thought, and for a moment I simply stood there, frozen, my hands still fumbling with the clasps on my work coveralls. Then the screaming started. It came from everywhere at once, from the units around me, from the corridors, from the levels above and below. Thousands of people plunged into sudden darkness, crying out in fear and confusion and rage. The walls seemed to amplify the sound, channeling it through the hab block's architecture until it became a sustained note of human terror. I moved carefully to my door, hands outstretched, feeling my way along walls I'd walked beside for 33 years, but which now felt alien and threatening. My fingers found the doorframe, the handle, and I pushed it open into a corridor that was somehow even darker than my unit. No windows here, just the eternal artificial light that had now abandoned us. "Emergency lumens," someone shouted from nearby. "They have to come on. They always come on." But minutes passed and no emergency lumens engaged. Whatever had taken out the main power had taken out the backups too. Or perhaps there simply weren't any backups. The Imperium built for durability and function, not for comfort or safety. Resources went to the war machine first, always. A few billion citizens trapped in darkness was the acceptable cost if it meant one more regiment could be equipped, one more warship could be launched. I felt my way back into my hab and found my work locker by memory and touch. Inside was my standard issue emergency kit. Every manufacturing worker received one, though most never opened them. I fumbled with the latches and pulled out a small lumen stick, the chemical kind that glowed when you snapped it. The crack seemed loud in the darkness, and then there was light. Weak, greenish, barely enough to illuminate my immediate surroundings, but light nonetheless. The corridor outside was chaos, visible in stuttering glimpses as other people activated their own emergency lights. Lumen sticks, candles, even one man with an ancient combustion lighter that threw dancing shadows against the walls. People were emerging from their units, calling out for neighbors, for family, for anyone who might know what was happening. A woman ran past me, clutching a crying child, heading for the stairwell. A man stood in his doorway, looking lost and old and afraid. "The water," someone said, and I felt my stomach drop. The water stopped flowing first. I should have realized it immediately. The pumps that pushed water up from the reclamation systems required power. And without power, there was no pressure, no flow, no life-sustaining liquid making its way through kilometers of ancient piping to reach us. I went back to my unit and tried the tap anyway. Some irrational hope saying that maybe, somehow, it would still work. It didn't. A few drops emerged. Brown and thick, and then nothing. Not even air moving through the pipes, just silence and emptiness and the beginning of thirst. By midday, if it was midday, time having become a slippery concept in the darkness, the first riots began. I heard them before I saw them, a roar of voices from somewhere below, accompanied by the crash of breaking doors and the high, keening sound of human suffering. The food distribution centers were being overrun, I realized. Without power, the security doors couldn't seal. Without Arbites to maintain order, and I suspected the Arbites had bigger problems now than protecting corpse starch stockpiles, the hungry masses were taking what they needed to survive. I should have stayed in my unit, should have sealed the door, rationed my remaining food and water, waited for order to be restored. But I was hungry too, and thirsty, and some primal instinct drove me to join the scavengers before there was nothing left to scavenge. The stairwell was packed with people, all heading down, drawn by the same desperate need. We moved in darkness, broken only by scattered chemical lights and the occasional candle, a river of humanity flowing downward. The air grew thick and hot. The ventilation systems were powered too, I realized, and without them we were breathing the accumulated exhalations of millions. Carbon dioxide building up, oxygen being slowly consumed. I descended 3 levels following the flow of the crowd and emerged into a market district I'd visited hundreds of times before. In the light, it had been a bustling place of commerce and exchange, vendors hawking their wares, shoppers haggling over prices, Arbites maintaining just enough order to keep things from descending into chaos. Now in the red glow of emergency lumens that had somehow activated here when they'd failed everywhere else, it looked like a scene from some ancient hell's world. The food distribution center had been breached. Its armored doors hung twisted on their hinges and people poured through like water through a broken dam. I joined them, swept up in the momentum, carried through into a storage facility that should have been organized and orderly, but was now being systematically stripped of everything edible. People fought over sacks of corpse starch, They screamed at each other over bottles of water. I saw a man crack another man's skull with a pipe over a container of vitamin supplements. Blood on the floor, mixing with spilled food and scattered ration tokens that no longer had any value. I grabbed what I could, 2 bricks of corpse starch that had fallen from a broken pallet, a plastic bottle of something that might be water or might be reclamation fluid. I didn't care. Someone tried to take them from me and I shoved them away harder than I meant to, sending them sprawling. The darkness made monsters of us all, reducing civilization to its most basic components: hunger, thirst, violence. I fled with my stolen goods clutched to my chest, pushing back through the crowd, heading for the stairwell, desperate to reach the relative safety of my HAB unit. Behind me, the riot was spreading, spilling out into the corridors like an infection. I heard the sharp crack of gunfire. Someone still had working weapons, still had ammunition, and the screams that followed. The climb back up was harder than the descent. My lungs burned in the oxygen-depleted air. My legs shook with exhaustion. The corpse starch bricks felt like they weighed 20 kilograms each, though I knew they couldn't be more than 1 or 2. People pushed past me, some fleeing the violence below, others rushing toward it with weapons improvised from pipe and metal in desperation. On level 212, I found a scavenging party coming back from somewhere deeper. There were 6 of them, all wearing respirators that looked like they'd been stolen from an industrial facility. They carried bags bulging with supplies, and they moved with the kind of purposeful violence that said they'd killed for what they had and would kill again to keep it. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, invisible. My lumen stick had died hours ago, and I moved now in near total darkness, guided only by memory and touch and the occasional flicker of other people's lights. The scavengers passed without noticing me, their heavy breathing amplified by their respirators, and I allowed myself a moment of relief. Then one of them stopped. "You," a voice said, distorted by the respirator's filters. "What you got in your hands?" I thought about running. Thought about fighting, but I was exhausted and half-starved, and I'd never been a violent man. My life had been the drill press and the rhythm and the obedience to authority. I didn't know how to be anything else. "Just some rations," I said, hating the weakness in my own voice. "From the distribution center. Hand them over. I need them. I haven't eaten in—" The pipe caught me across the shoulder, sending lightning bolts of pain down my arm. I dropped one of the corpse starch bricks, heard it hit the floor with a dull thud. Hands grabbed at me, rifling through my pockets, taking the water bottle, taking the remaining brick of compressed food. "Should kill him," one of the scavengers said. "He's seen us." "Not worth it," another replied. "Save the energy." They left me there in the darkness, gasping with pain, empty-handed except for the knowledge that civilization had ended. Not with the tremors, not with the structural collapse, but here, now, in this moment when human beings stopped being human and became simply animals competing for survival. I made it back to my HAB unit somehow. The door was still sealed, small mercy, and I collapsed inside, my shoulder throbbing, my stomach empty, my throat so dry it hurt to swallow. In the absolute blackness, I felt my way to my sleeping pallet and lay down, trying to make my body understand that there was no food coming, that it would have to survive on whatever reserves it had stored. That night, or what I thought was night time having lost all meaning, I heard them below us. The mob had risen from the lower levels, driven upward by the same instinct that drives rats from a sinking ship. They were screaming, praying, fighting, dying. The sound came up through the ventilation shafts, through the gaps in the rockcrete, through the very bones of the structure. It was like being inside a massive throat listening to the city scream. And beneath it all, regular as a heartbeat, came the tremors. Smaller now, but constant. The city was settling or collapsing, or simply dying by degrees. Each vibration brought with it the groan of overstressed metal, the crack of breaking stone, the distant crash of something giving way. I activated another lumen stick, my last one, just to have some light, even if it was temporary. In its greenish glow, I looked around my HAB unit and saw my entire life. The work coveralls hanging on their hook, the Emperor's shrine with its purity seals and prayer scrolls, the small collection of possessions that had seemed important once but now meant nothing. 33 years of service, of obedience, of pulling the lever and stamping the component and maintaining the rhythm. And for what? The lumen stick began to fade after a few hours, its chemical reaction exhausting itself. I watched the light die by degrees, the shadows growing deeper and deeper until finally I was plunged back into absolute darkness. But before it went out completely, I saw something that made my breath catch. A crack in the wall. A thin line running from floor to ceiling, zigzagging like lightning frozen in stone. It hadn't been there before. The HAB block itself was fracturing, coming apart around us, and we were trapped inside with no power, no water, no food, no hope of rescue. I lay in the darkness and listened to the city die. The air grew thick and hot as the days passed. I lost count after a while, measuring time only in the intervals between thirst becoming unbearable and sleep claiming me briefly before the nightmares woke me again. Without ventilation, the atmosphere in the HAB block became toxic, carbon dioxide building up, oxygen being slowly consumed by millions of lungs, all breathing the same air over and over again. People started dying, not from violence, though there was plenty of that. Not from the tremors, though those continued their irregular rhythm, but from simple biological failure, dehydration, suffocation, the body giving up when pushed beyond its limits. I found the first corpse in the corridor outside my unit on what might have been the 8th or 9th day. An old man I'd seen around the HAB block for years, always greeting everyone with a smile and a prayer. He was slumped against the wall, mouth open, eyes staring at nothing. I felt for a pulse out of some vestigial sense of duty, found nothing, and moved on. By the next day there were more. Bodies in the stairwells, in the corridors, in the units where they'd sealed themselves in and simply run out of everything. The smell was indescribable, rotten decay and human waste, all of it trapped in the enclosed space with no way out. I joined another scavenging party on the 10th day, or maybe the 11th. We descended into the darkness like a pack of starving dogs, picking through abandoned HAB units, looking for anything, water, food, chemical lights, anything. We found mostly corpses and emptiness. The lower we went, the worse it got. Entire levels had been stripped clean, and the bodies of those who'd tried to defend their meager supplies lay where they'd fallen. On level 197, we found a HAB unit that had been barricaded from the inside. The door had been reinforced with metal plates and sealed with what looked like industrial adhesive. We could hear something moving inside, scratching, breathing, the sound of life. "Open up!" one of my companions shouted, hammering on the door. "We're not here to hurt you, we're just looking for supplies." No response, just more scratching, more breathing. We broke through eventually, using a piece of rebar as a battering ram. The door gave way with a shriek of tortured metal, and we pushed inside, chemical lights held high. The family inside had been dead for days, a mother, father, 3 children, all laid out neatly on sleeping pallets as if they were just resting. But their lips were blue, their faces sunken, and the smell told us everything we needed to know. They'd sealed themselves in, rationed what they had, and when the water ran out, they'd simply laid down and waited for the end. The scratching sound came from the corner, a small pet, some kind of rodent native to the Underhive, grown fat on the flesh of its former owners. One of the scavengers killed it with his pipe, more out of disgust than hunger, though I suspect if we'd been another few days without food, we might have considered eating it. We found nothing useful in that hab. The family had consumed everything they had before dying. Back in my own unit, I discovered that my water reclamation system had started working again, but not in any way I would have wanted. Instead of clean water, it was venting some kind of toxic sludge, probably backed up from failed pipes below, flowing upward through the system in defiance of gravity and sense. The smell drove me out into the corridor, where at least the stench was general rather than specific. I wasn't alone. Other residents of my floor had gathered there, sitting with their backs against the walls, conserving energy, waiting for something they couldn't name. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We were dying slowly, and we all knew it. "How long do you think?" someone asked in the darkness. A woman's voice cracked and hoarse from dehydration. "Until what?" another voice replied. "Until it's over. Until we're all dead." "Not long," a third voice said. "The air's getting worse, I can feel it, hard to breathe." "Should pray," someone suggested. The Emperor's not listening," the third voice cut in. "If he was listening, we wouldn't be here." Heresy. That statement was pure heresy, punishable by death under Imperial law. But no one called the Arbites. No one reported it. What would be the point? The law had broken down along with everything else. We were beyond punishment now, beyond redemption. We were just dying animals waiting for the end. I thought about the drill press I'd operated for 33 years. Wondered if it was still there in Manufactorum Delta 79, or if that entire section had collapsed into rubble. Wondered if anyone would ever stamp another component there, or if the factory had produced its last piece of the Imperium's great machine. It seemed impossibly important in that moment, not my life, but the continuity of that simple mechanical rhythm. Pull the lever, stamp the component, repeat forever. But forever had ended. The final descent came on what I think was the 14th day, though I'd lost all ability to track time with any accuracy. I woke, if you could call the half-conscious state I'd been in sleep, to find myself unable to breathe properly. Not the gradual difficulty of bad air, but something acute and immediate. My lungs burned with each inhalation, and I tasted something chemical and wrong. In the darkness, I heard others coughing, choking, gasping for air that was killing them even as it kept them alive. The industrial sectors below had ruptured. I didn't need to see it to know it. Somewhere in the deep hive, in the manufactorums and refineries and chemical plants that processed the raw materials of Imperial industry, something had given way. Tanks had burst, pipes had fractured, containment vessels had failed, and now everything they held was venting upward through the hive's ventilation systems. Promethium fumes, industrial solvents, radiation from cracked reactors, toxins with no names that existed only in the nightmares of tech priests. The air itself had become poison. People were screaming now, clawing at their throats, trying to breathe through fabric that offered no protection. I wrapped my work coveralls around my face, pressing the rough cloth against my mouth and nose, but it was like trying to filter water through sand. The chemicals came through anyway, burning my lungs, making my eyes weep and my skin blister. I had to climb, had to get higher where the air might still be breathable, had to move or die. I stumbled into the corridor, joining a river of humanity, all with the same desperate instinct. The stairwell was chaos, people pushing, shoving, trampling those who fell. I climbed over bodies, some dead, some merely dying, my vision blurred. My lungs screamed for oxygen that wasn't coming. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. Level 215, 216, 217. The numbers were painted on the walls in faded luminescent paint, barely visible in the scattered light of chemical lumen sticks and dying flashlights. I climbed until my legs gave out, until I couldn't take another step, until I collapsed against a wall and slid down to sit in the darkness, gasping and coughing and tasting blood. Around me, thousands of others were doing the same. We'd climbed as high as we could go, but the poison was following us, rising through the hive like floodwater, and there was nowhere left to run. I thought about my mother dying in a textile factory, her lungs destroyed by chemical fumes not so different from these. I thought about the anonymous father I'd never known, lost somewhere in the hive's vastness. I thought about 33 years of service, of obedience, of doing exactly what I was told because that's what you did. And I thought, this is how it ends. Not with purpose or meaning or even dignity. Just drowning in poison, another anonymous corpse in billions unmourned and unremembered, ground up in the machinery of the Imperium's eternal war. The darkness pressed in. The poison filled my lungs, and somewhere far below in the depths I could no longer see or reach, the city continued its slow collapse, taking us all down with it into the dark. We felt the great spire fall, though we could not see it, a vibration so profound it seemed the planet itself had been struck. I was semi-conscious when it happened. Lying in a corridor on level 219, my makeshift respirator, strips of cloth soaked in my own urine, the ammonia supposedly filtering some of the chemicals, pressed against my face. Around me lay dozens of others in similar states, our bodies slowly shutting down from toxin exposure, dehydration, and starvation. We had become a human carpet of suffering, packed so tightly in the upper levels that you couldn't walk without stepping on someone. The vibration started deep, deeper than any of the previous tremors. It was less a sound and more a feeling, a fundamental wrongness that resonated in your bones and teeth and skull. For a moment in my delirium, I thought it was my own body finally giving up, my heart stopping, my brain misfiring its final electrical impulses. Then the sound arrived. It came seconds after the vibration, traveling slower through air than through the solid structure of the hive. A roar, a scream, a thunder so catastrophic and sustained that it didn't seem like it could be produced by anything physical, anything real. It went on, building in intensity until it was everything. Until the universe consisted only of that terrible sound and nothing else. People around me who'd been unconscious jerked awake, screaming though their screams were inaudible beneath the greater roar. Hands clutched at ears, trying to block out the sound and failing. I felt liquid warmth in my own ears. Blood, I realized dimly, my eardrums rupturing under the acoustic assault. The shock wave followed. A wall of displaced air traveling at impossible speed through the hive's corridors and ventilation shafts. A wind that had never existed in these enclosed spaces before. It picked me up and slammed me against the opposite wall with enough force to crack ribs. Others weren't so lucky. I saw bodies ragdolling through the air, tumbling, breaking against unyielding rockcrete and steel. And then came the debris. Dust first, a cloud so thick it was like being underwater, like drowning in particulate matter. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but curl into a ball and try to protect my head as larger pieces began to fall. Chunks of rockcrete, twisted metal, pieces of furniture and machinery and human remains, all of it raining down from above, bouncing off walls and floors, and people with wet, meaty sounds that cut through even the sustained roar. The spire was falling. I didn't understand it immediately, couldn't understand it, my mind refusing to process the scale of what was happening. The great spire of the hive, the central column that rose kilometers above the main city body, the palace fortress where the planetary governor reigned. The symbol of imperial authority and power that had stood for 10,000 years. It was falling. Billions of tons of worked metal and stone, ornate architecture and ancient machinery, centuries of accumulated wealth and power, now a spear being driven down through the hive's heart. The impacts came in waves, The top of the spire hitting first, punching through whatever level it encountered, then the next section, then the next, each one adding its weight and momentum to the catastrophic descent. I could track it by sound and vibration. Boom, 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 like the footsteps of a god walking through the city. Each step crushing entire levels, entire communities, entire populations. The dust was so thick now I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. I breathed it in and felt it coat my lungs, turning my breathing into a wet, rattling wheeze. Around me I could hear others coughing, choking, dying. The corridor had become a charnel house, bodies piled on bodies, the living indistinguishable from the dead. The destruction cascaded downward in waves. Each level the spire punched through destabilized the levels around it, creating chain reactions of structural failure that spread like disease through ancient bones. Load-bearing columns, already weakened by the previous tremors, simply gave way. Foundations that had stood since the Hive's founding cracked and crumbled. Entire sectors pancaked onto the ones below. The process accelerating as more and more weight pressed down from above. I crawled. I don't know where I thought I was going or what I hoped to accomplish, but some animal instinct drove me to move, to put distance between myself and the worst of the collapse. My hands found bodies and debris and slick, wet things I didn't want to identify. I pulled myself forward inch by inch, following some dim sense that maybe somehow there was a pocket of safety somewhere in this hell. A hand grabbed my ankle. I kicked reflexively, panicked, but the grip held firm. Then a voice, barely audible through the sustained thunder. "Help me, please, I can't move my legs." I turned back, though I couldn't see who was speaking. Found a body half buried under rubble, warm and breathing but trapped. Male or female, young or old. I couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. I grabbed their arms and pulled, trying to drag them free, but something had them pinned. A piece of structural steel, maybe, or a section of collapsed ceiling. "I'm stuck," the voice said, calm in a way that suggested shock or acceptance or both. "You should go before—" The next impact hit close, so close I felt the floor buckle beneath me. The world tilted sideways and I was sliding, tumbling, falling through darkness and dust and the screams of 10,000 dying people. I hit something hard, felt more ribs crack, tasted blood and dust and the particular flavor of despair. When I stopped moving, I had no idea where I was. Up and down had lost all meaning. The corridor I'd been in, if it still existed, could have been above me or below me or simply gone, crushed into the same compressed rubble that was rapidly filling the Hive's interior. The sound was fading now, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore. My damaged ears unable to process anything beyond a high-pitched ringing. But I could still feel the impacts through the structure, each one a hammer blow against the dying city. Boom, boom, boom. How far would it fall? All the way to bedrock? Would it punch through the Hive's foundation entirely and keep going, driving down into the planet's crust like a nail being hammered home? I lay in the darkness, a darkness now filled with so much dust that breathing was more drowning than respiration, and tried to understand the scale of what had just happened. The spire had held millions of people. The governor's palace alone employed tens of thousands. The administrative complexes, the wealthy Hab districts, the shrines and cathedrals and monuments to imperial glory, all of it gone in minutes, compressed into rubble, adding its weight to the cascade of destruction. And it wasn't just the spire itself. The shockwave of its fall had destabilized everything around it. I could feel the ripples spreading through the structure, new collapses triggering in response to the first, a domino effect of catastrophic failure that would spread for hours or days or until the entire Hive was nothing but a mountain of twisted metal and pulverized stone. Light appeared somewhere to my left, weak, flickering but light nonetheless. I crawled toward it, desperate for any reference point in the absolute confusion of the dust-choked darkness. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a breach in the wall, a crack opened by the impacts that revealed a space beyond. I pulled myself through, scraping already raw skin against jagged edges of broken rockcrete. On the other side was what had once been a major transit corridor, wide enough for vehicles, now transformed into something from a nightmare. The ceiling had partially collapsed, creating a landscape of rubble and twisted support beams. Emergency lumens were still functioning here, somehow against all probability, casting everything in that familiar sickly red. Bodies everywhere, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, piled against the walls where they'd been thrown by the shockwave or buried under falling debris. Some were moving, crawling, trying to find a way out or a way up, or just trying to find anything that wasn't death. Most were still. And the sky. I looked up through the gaps in the collapsed ceiling and saw the sky for the first time in my life. Not the manufactured sky of the Hive's upper reaches, not the distant shimmer of atmospheric processors and light wells, but the actual sky. The real sky. It was gray or maybe brown, choked with a rising cloud of dust and ash so thick it blotted out whatever sun might have existed. The cloud was mushrooming upward, billions of tons of pulverized city becoming airborne, rising into the atmosphere like smoke from the largest fire ever kindled. In the crimson emergency lighting filtered through the ash cloud above, it looked like the end of the world. "It's gone," someone said nearby, their voice flat and emotionless. "The whole spire, just gone." I turned to see a woman sitting with her back against a pillar, her leg bent at an angle that said it was broken. She was staring up at the sky with the expression of someone whose mind had simply given up trying to process reality. "Did you see it?" she asked, not looking at me. "Did you see it fall?" "No," I managed to croak, my voice raw from dust and screaming and thirst. "I felt it. Billions," she said. "There must have been billions in the spire. And all the levels it fell through, all the people it crushed on the way down. How many? 5 billion? 10? I didn't answer. The numbers were too large to mean anything. A single death was a tragedy you could understand. One person, one life, one story ended. But billions? That was just a statistic, a number in an administratum ledger, abstract and meaningless. "We're never getting out," the woman continued, still staring at the ash-filled sky. "Even if we survive the collapse, even if we find food and water, we're trapped." The spire was the way out. All the main transit shafts ran through it. The cargo lifts, the emergency evacuation routes. It was the spine of the Hive, and now... She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Now we're paralyzed." She was right, I realized. The Hive wasn't just a collection of hab blocks and factories stacked on top of each other. It was a carefully engineered structure where every part supported every other part, where essential systems ran through central conduits, where the logic of 10 millennia of construction had created dependencies that no one fully understood anymore. The spire hadn't just been a palace for the wealthy, it had been the Hive's nervous system, and now that nervous system had been severed. We were cut off, isolated. Whatever happened to us now, we would face it alone. The tremors continued through the night, though I had no way of knowing if it was actually night, time having become another casualty of the collapse. They were different now, less violent but more sustained, a constant vibration that suggested the Hive was still settling, still adjusting to the massive wound that had been carved through its heart. I found a relatively clear space away from the worst of the bodies and collapsed there, my broken ribs making every breath an agony. Sleep was impossible, but I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind unable to hold on to reality for more than a few minutes at a time. In my delirium, I saw the drill press, saw my hands pulling the lever over and over, the hydraulic ram descending, the component being stamped. Pull the lever. Stamp the component, the rhythm that had been my entire life, the rhythm that had given meaning and purpose to 33 years of existence. But the drill press was silent now. The manufactorum was gone, buried under the spire's fall, or poisoned by chemical leaks, or simply abandoned when the workers realized no one was going to pay them anymore. No one was going to feed them anymore. No one cared if they lived or died. The great machine of the Imperium had stopped, at least in this one city on this one world, and I was just a broken cog lying in the wreckage waiting for entropy to finish its work. When I opened my eyes again, minutes or hours later, I couldn't tell. I saw that the ash cloud above had grown darker, thicker. It was falling now, a gray snow of pulverized city settling over everything, coating the bodies and the rubble and my own skin in a fine layer of death. I brushed it away from my face, but it kept coming, endless and inexorable. The woman with the broken leg was gone. Either she'd crawled away, or someone had moved her body, or she'd simply been buried under the accumulating ash. Her spot against the pillar was empty except for a dark stain that might have been blood. I tried to stand and made it halfway before my legs gave out. The combination of injuries, dehydration, and exposure was shutting my body down by degrees. I could feel it happening, the gradual slowing of my heart, the dimming of my thoughts, the creeping coldness that started in my extremities and worked its way inward. This is how it ends, I thought again. Not in the initial fall, not crushed under billions of tons of stone, but slowly, painfully, dying of 1,000 small injuries and deprivations while the city's corpse settles around me. In the darkness that followed, because the emergency lumens were failing now too, flickering and dying one by one, I realized we would never see daylight again. That brief glimpse of the sky, choked with ash and dust, would be the only time in my life I saw the world beyond the Hive's walls. And even that had been obscured, filtered through the funeral shroud of a collapsing civilization. The Emperor protects, they always said. But the Emperor wasn't here. The Emperor was fighting wars on 1,000 fronts, managing an Imperium that spanned the galaxy, dealing with threats and heresies and xenos that I couldn't even imagine. The Emperor didn't have time for one Hive city on one world. Didn't have time for the billions dying in the collapse. Didn't have time for me. We were on our own. We had always been on our own. And now finally we were paying the price for pretending otherwise. Sanity collapsed faster than the architecture. I don't know when exactly it happened, when the line between civilization and chaos was finally, irrevocably crossed. But by the time I was strong enough to move again, the world had transformed into something unrecognizable. The rules that had governed human behavior for 10,000 years, the social contracts that kept billions of people from tearing each other apart, the thin veneer of order that separated us from animals, all of it had evaporated like water on hot metal. In the choking darkness, cults emerged like maggots from rotting meat. I first encountered them on what I thought was the 17th or 18th day, though time had become so elastic and meaningless that I might have been off by weeks. I was scavenging through a collapsed section of level 220, picking over the rubble for anything useful. Water, food, chemical lights, anything that might extend my survival by another few hours. My ribs had started to heal, or at least the acute agony had dulled to a constant ache that I could almost ignore. My breathing was still labored from the chemical exposure, each inhalation accompanied by a wet rattle that suggested permanent damage to my lungs. I heard them before I saw them, a rhythmic chanting echoing through the darkness, dozens of voices raised in unison, speaking words that weren't Low Gothic or any other language I recognized. The sound had a hypnotic quality, rising and falling in waves, punctuated by periodic screams that might have been ecstasy or agony or both. I should have gone the other way, should have recognized danger and avoided it. But I was drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes you look at corpses, that makes you probe wounds just to see how deep they go. I moved toward the sound, using my hands to navigate through the rubble-strewn darkness, following the chanting to its source. They had gathered in what had once been a commercial plaza, a wide space where shops and vendors would have done business in better times. Now it was filled with perhaps 200 people, all kneeling in concentric circles around a makeshift altar constructed from human bones and scrap metal. Chemical lights and candles provided illumination, casting wild shadows that danced across faces that were gaunt and hollow-eyed and utterly mad. At the center stood a preacher, if that's what you could call him. He was naked except for strips of flayed skin that he'd wrapped around himself like vestments, his body covered in self-inflicted wounds that oozed in the candlelight. He held a human skull in one hand, recent enough that scraps of flesh still clung to it, and used it to gesture as he spoke. "The Emperor has abandoned us," he shrieked, his voice cracking with fervor. "He sits upon his golden throne and watches us die with indifference. We who have served, we who have labored, we who have given everything in his name. And for what? For this." He gestured at the ruins around us. "For death in darkness, for burial in our own city." The crowd responded with that inhuman chanting, swaying back and forth, some of them weeping, others laughing hysterically. "But there are older gods," the preacher continued. "Gods who remember us, gods who care, gods who offer salvation to those wise enough to embrace them. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Join us in worship and know true freedom." I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't just desperation or madness, this was heresy of the highest order. Worship of the ruinous powers, the ancient enemies of mankind, the corrupting forces that the Imperium had fought for 10 millennia. To even speak such things was punishable by death. To actively worship them was damnation beyond redemption. But who was going to punish them? The Arbites were gone or dead, or had become just another gang fighting for survival. The ecclesiarchy priests who should have rooted out such corruption were either buried under the spire's fall or had abandoned their flocks to save themselves. The Inquisition, the ultimate authority on matters of heresy and corruption, was light years away, dealing with threats they deemed more important. We were beyond the Imperium's reach now, beyond its laws, beyond its protection. And in that absence, older things were creeping back in. I backed away slowly, trying not to attract attention, but my foot dislodged a piece of rubble that clattered across the ground with a sound like breaking bones. The preacher's head snapped toward me. His eyes, I could see them clearly now, were wrong. The pupils were too large, the whites veined with red, and they seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the candles. "A witness," he cried, pointing at me with the skull. "A soul yet unclaimed. Brothers and sisters, shall we bring him into the fold?" The crowd turned as one, 200 pairs of eyes fixing on me in the darkness, and I ran. I ran through the darkness with no idea where I was going, just away, always away. Behind me, I could hear them following, not chasing exactly, but pursuing with the patient inevitability of hunters who know their prey has nowhere to go. Their chanting followed me through the corridors, echoing off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I found a narrow maintenance shaft and squeezed inside, pulling myself up through vertical darkness using service ladders that were slick with moisture and rust. My broken ribs screamed with every movement, but fear is a powerful anesthetic. I climbed until my arms gave out, until I found a horizontal duct I could crawl into, until I was deep enough in the Hive's mechanical guts that even the chanting couldn't reach me. I lay there in absolute darkness, gasping and shaking, and realized that the cult wasn't an isolated incident. In the absence of order, in the face of death and suffering beyond comprehension, people were turning to anything that offered hope or meaning or just an explanation for why this was happening. And if the Emperor wasn't answering their prayers, and he clearly wasn't, then they would find gods who would. Over the following days, I encountered other cults. Some worshipped the traditional chaos powers, offering blood and flesh and sanity to entities that existed beyond reality. Others had created their own religions, based on nothing more than shared delusion and desperate need. I saw people praying to the Hive itself, treating it as a living god that demanded sacrifice. I saw cannibals who had ritualized their consumption of the dead, turning necessity into sacrament. I saw groups that had simply given up on gods entirely and embraced nihilism, seeking only to experience every sensation before death claimed them. But it wasn't just religious madness that spread through the dying city. It was madness of every kind. I watched neighbors turn on each other over a single flask of reclaimed water, fighting with their bare hands, biting and clawing like animals. Two men who'd probably worked side by side for years, who'd shared drinks and complained about the overseers and helped each other meet quotas, reduced to murder over a few swallows of liquid. I saw families barricade themselves in their habs and refuse entry to their own kin. A woman screaming at her sister through a sealed door, begging to be let in, promising she had food to share. The sister inside refusing, paranoid that it was a trick, that her sibling would kill her and take everything. The sister outside eventually collapsing from exhaustion, dying there in the corridor while her family member listened from the other side of 1/2 meter of metal. The Arbites had tried to maintain order in the beginning. I'd seen them in their riot gear, their carapace armor and shock mauls, forming shield walls and firing warning shots and trying to impose the Emperor's law on a population that no longer believed in law. But they were human too, and humans break when pushed hard enough. I found what was left of an Arbite's patrol on level 223. 5 of them still in their armor, lying in a defensive circle with their backs to each other. Their ammunition had run dry. I could see the empty shell casings scattered around them like metallic seeds, and they'd been torn apart by a mob that had simply overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. Hands and nails and teeth had done what shock mauls and shotguns couldn't prevent. I took one of their helmets, thinking it might offer some protection from falling debris or chemical exposure. Inside, I found a data slate still displaying the last message the patrol had received. All units withdraw to Fortress Precinct immediately. Situation untenable, no reinforcements available. Preserve personnel for future operations. Emperor protects. Future operations. As if there would be a future. As if anyone would survive to participate in operations. The Arbites' command had abandoned their own people, pulled back to whatever stronghold they thought they could defend, leaving the rest of the city to burn. I kept the helmet but left the bodies. They had nothing else I could use, and I was afraid that if I stayed too long, whatever mob had killed them might return to see if they'd missed anything. Cannibalism began in the lowest levels and spread upward like contamination. It started as whispers, rumors that no one wanted to believe. Stories of people in the Underhive doing unspeakable things to survive. But the Underhive had always been a place of horrors, and it was easy to dismiss such tales as exaggerations or lies. Then I saw it myself. I was scavenging through an abandoned hab block on level 215 when I smelled cooking meat. My stomach clenched with hunger so intense it was painful. I hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, surviving on scraps and hope and the occasional mouthful of questionable water. The smell drew me like a moth to flame, overriding every instinct that told me to be cautious. I found them in a communal space that had once been used for gatherings and celebrations. A dozen people sitting around a fire they'd built in a metal barrel, the smoke venting up through a convenient hole in the ceiling. They had a pot over the fire, something bubbling inside, and they were passing around bowls and eating with the kind of desperate hunger I understood intimately. "Room for one more?" I asked, my voice hoarse. They looked at me with eyes that held calculation and suspicion, but also a strange kind of camaraderie, the fellowship of the damned. "You got anything to trade?" one of them asked, an older man with a scar that ran from his eye to his jaw. "No," I admitted, "but I can work. I can help scavenge. "We don't need more scavengers," a woman interrupted. She was young, maybe 20, but her eyes were ancient. "We need more meat." The way she said it made my skin crawl. I looked at the pot more carefully, at what was floating in the broth, and recognized the shape of a human hand. Fingers curled as if grasping at something that wasn't there. I backed away slowly, my hunger suddenly forgotten, replaced by nausea and horror. "Don't be squeamish," the scarred man said. "We all got to eat. The dead don't need their meat anymore. Waste not, want not. That's what the administratum always said, right? Efficient use of resources." He said it so reasonably, with such casual logic, that for a moment I almost believed him. Almost convinced myself that this was just another form of recycling, no different than the corpse starch we'd been eating our entire lives. But corpse starch was processed, rendered, transformed into something that didn't look like what it had been. This was different. This was immediate and visceral and wrong at a level that transcended rationality. "The Emperor commands us not to waste his children," the woman added, her voice taking on the cadence of prayer. "We honor the dead by using their sacrifice to sustain the living. It's holy work, really, sacred." They'd rationalized it, found a way to make it acceptable, even righteous. And I realized with sick certainty that I would eventually do the same if I survived long enough. Hunger has a way of eroding principles, of making the unthinkable seem first possible, then necessary, then righteous. I left them to their meal and kept moving, but I encountered it again and again in the days that followed. Groups that had moved from scavenging corpses to hunting the living. People who lured others with promises of food or safety only to butcher them for meat. I heard screams in the darkness that ended in wet, tearing sounds. Found gnawed bones in corners and alcoves. Saw blood on walls that was too fresh to have come from the initial collapses. We had become predators to each other, reducing human interaction to its most basic equation: eat or be eaten. The walls echoed with the sounds of the mad, screaming prayers to the Emperor that were never answered, hysterical laughter from those whose minds had simply broken under the strain, the wet sounds of feeding that no longer carried any shame or concealment. The city had become one vast asylum, and we were all inmates. I stopped counting the days because time had ceased to have meaning in this sunless hell. There was only before and after, before the collapse, when life had meaning and purpose and rhythm, and after, when we were reduced to simple biological imperatives. Breathe, drink, eat, survive. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else was possible. I met a man who had started collecting eyes, not for food. He claimed they were inedible, too much like jelly, but because he believed that if he gathered enough of them, if he created a massive enough pile, the Emperor would finally see him and grant him salvation. He carried them in a bag made from human skin, hundreds of dried eyeballs rattling around inside like dice. He showed them to me with pride, like a child displaying a collection of precious stones. I met a woman who spent her days crawling through the ruins, searching for her children. She described them in perfect detail, their ages, their names, what they'd been wearing when she lost them. She showed me a picture she kept pressed against her chest, protected in a waterproof case. The picture showed children, yes, but they were ancient. The photo, degraded and faded, dated from decades ago. Her children would be adults now if they'd survived. But in her mind, they were still young, still lost, still waiting for her to find them. I met a group that had decided to accelerate the collapse, believing that if they could bring the entire hive down faster, if they could complete the destruction, then whatever came after would have to be better than this. They worked with tools and explosives they'd scavenged, targeting support structures, planting charges, cheering when they felt new tremors that might have been caused by their sabotage or might have been natural, but they didn't care either way. The madness was everywhere, in everyone, and I realized that I wasn't immune. That the thoughts in my head were growing stranger, more disconnected from reality. That I sometimes forgot who I was or where I was going or why survival mattered. That I had conversations with people who weren't there, with memories and ghosts and the voice of the drill press that had been my life's work. Pull the lever. Stamp the component. Pull the lever. Stamp the component. The rhythm was gone, but the memory of it remained, playing in an endless loop in my damaged mind. Sometimes I would find myself making the motions, reaching out with hands that held nothing, pulling on a lever that didn't exist, listening for the hydraulic ram that would never descend again. I was going mad. We were all going mad. And there was no one left to care. The industrial sectors below had ruptured, venting their poisoned contents into the hive's ventilation systems. Promethium, chemical waste, radiation from cracked reactors, toxins with no names. The air itself became a weapon. It happened gradually at first, then all at once, the way catastrophes always unfold. The initial chemical leaks from the early collapses had been bad enough, causing burns and respiratory damage and death to those directly exposed. But what came after was worse, because it was systematic and inescapable. The hive's industrial capacity was concentrated in the deep levels, the forgotten zones where massive reactors and refineries and chemical plants processed the raw materials of Imperial production. These facilities had been built to last millennia, designed with redundant safety systems and fail-safes upon fail-safes. But nothing was designed to survive the kind of structural damage the collapse had inflicted. Support structures had failed, containment vessels had cracked, cooling systems had gone offline, and now in the darkness and chaos beyond, everything that should have been safely contained was bleeding out into the ventilation network that connected every level of the hive. I first noticed the change in the air on what I estimated was the 21st or 22nd day. I'd been working my way higher, always higher, driven by some instinct that said elevation meant safety. But the climb was becoming harder with each level, not because of physical obstacles, but because breathing itself had become an act of violence against my own body. The caustic fog that rose from below was visible now. A yellow-green miasma that moved through the corridors like something alive. It hugged the ground, flowing downhill when there was any grade, pooling in low places and abandoned chambers. When it touched exposed skin, it burned, not with the immediate searing pain of fire, but with a delayed agony that built over minutes until you were clawing at yourself, trying to remove flesh that had been contaminated at a molecular level. I'd wrapped every available piece of cloth around my face, creating a makeshift respirator that filtered almost nothing but at least kept the worst of the fumes out of my lungs. My eyes wept constantly, producing tears that stung and blurred my vision. My skin had developed a rash that never healed, angry red welts that oozed clear fluid and itched with an intensity that made me want to tear my own flesh off. But I was lucky. I was still mobile, still capable of climbing, still alive. Others weren't so fortunate. The bodies were everywhere now, and these weren't the corpses of violence or starvation. These were the victims of atmospheric poisoning, frozen in grotesque positions that told stories of their final moments. Some had clutched their throats, trying to force air through windpipes that had swollen shut. Others had clawed at their own faces, driven mad by the burning in their eyes and lungs. Many had simply collapsed where they stood, their bodies shutting down all at once when the toxin concentration reached lethal levels. I found an entire family that had tried to seal themselves in their hab unit, stuffing rags under the door and around the ventilation grate, creating what they thought was an airtight sanctuary. But the gases had found their way in anyway, invisible, patient, inexorable. They were all dead now, positioned around their small shrine to the Emperor, their final act one of prayer and hope that had gone unanswered. I took their cloth before I left, adding it to my own respirator, trying to build enough layers to filter the poison. It didn't help much. Nothing helped much. The air was killing us all slowly, and there was nowhere to run. The coughing never stopped. It was the soundtrack to our dying. Thousands, millions of people all coughing at once, a wet, phlegmy chorus that echoed through every corridor and chamber. Some people coughed so hard they ruptured blood vessels, painting the walls with red mist. Others coughed until they broke ribs or collapsed lungs or simply asphyxiated on their own fluids. I coughed constantly now, bringing up things that were black and thick and wrong. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, each breath a reminder that I was destroying myself from within just by staying alive. Blood appeared in my sputum regularly, sometimes bright red, sometimes dark and clotted, sometimes mixed with tissue that I knew was pieces of my own lungs being expelled. My vision had started to blur, not from tears this time, but from something more fundamental. The chemicals in the air were affecting my nervous system, damaging the delicate structures of my eyes, causing my sight to dim and waver like a candle in the wind. Sometimes I saw double. Sometimes I saw colors that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I saw nothing at all, just darkness even when there was light. I climbed. I always climbed. It was the only thing left to do. The toxic fog was rising from below, following us upward, and the only hope, irrational, desperate, probably futile, was that there might be clean air at the top levels near where the Hive met the planet's actual atmosphere. I didn't know if it was true. Had no way of knowing, but it gave me a direction, a purpose, something to focus on besides the pain. The stairs were crowded with others who'd had the same idea. We passed each other like ghosts, not speaking. Speaking required breath we couldn't afford to waste, just shuffling upward in a line that extended as far as I could see in either direction. Sometimes someone would collapse and we would step over or around them without stopping. Sometimes someone would fall backward down the stairs, taking others with them in a tumbling cascade of bodies. Sometimes the person ahead of you would simply stop breathing mid-step, their body going rigid before toppling sideways. We kept climbing. On level 235, I found a breach in the exterior wall, a crack opened by the spire's fall that actually led outside the Hive. I could see through it, see the world beyond our prison, and what I saw made me understand just how comprehensively we were doomed. The toxic cloud wasn't just inside the Hive, it had vented into the atmosphere, creating a dome of poison that covered the entire city and spread for kilometers in every direction. The sky, the real sky I'd glimpsed so briefly after the spire fell, was gone, replaced by a roiling yellow-brown mass that churned and boiled like something alive. Lightning flickered inside it, not the clean electricity of storms, but something chemical and wrong, green and purple discharges that lit the cloud from within. And it was descending. The atmospheric pressure was pushing the toxic cloud back down, back into the city, ensuring that there was no escape, no clean air to be found no matter how high we climbed. We were in a gas chamber, a poison bottle, a sealed tomb where the air itself was the executioner. I pulled away from the breach, unable to look anymore, and continued climbing. My body was shutting down by increments. I could feel it happening, feel systems failing one after another like lights going out in sequence. My kidneys weren't processing waste properly. I could tell from the color and smell of my urine when I could produce any at all. My liver was overwhelmed by the toxins, causing my skin to take on a yellowish tinge that spoke of jaundice and organ failure. My heart was working harder and harder to pump blood that was increasingly acidic, increasingly poisoned, through vessels that were inflamed and constricting. I had days left at most, maybe hours, but I kept climbing because what else was there to do? Lie down and die? Give up? After everything I'd survived, the collapses, the starvation, the violence, the madness, to simply surrender now seemed like a betrayal of the effort it had taken to get this far. On level 242, I caught up to a group that had stopped climbing. There were maybe 30 of them sitting or lying on the stairs, their backs against the walls, their makeshift respirators hanging loose around their necks. They'd given up, decided that this was far enough, that there was no point in going higher because death was waiting no matter what they did. One of them, a woman who might have been beautiful once before the chemicals ravaged her face, looked up as I approached. Her eyes were filmed over with cataracts or chemical burns, rendering her mostly blind. "Are you an angel?" she asked, her voice a rasping whisper. "Have you come to take us to the Emperor?" "No," I said, the word emerging as a cough. "Just a man." "Oh." She sounded disappointed. I thought maybe he'd sent someone to collect us, to tell us it mattered, that we mattered." I had no answer for that. I walked past her, past all of them, continuing up the stairs that stretched endlessly above. "Wait," she called after me. "Where are you going?" "Up," I said, not stopping. "But there's nothing up there, no food, no water, no help, just more stairs and more darkness and more death." "I know." "Then why?" I paused, turned back to look at her blind eyes and ruined face. "Because I'm not done yet. Because I refuse to die sitting down. Because..." I coughed, the spasm racking my frame. "Because the lever hasn't been pulled for the last time. The component hasn't been stamped. The rhythm isn't finished." She didn't understand. How could she? I barely understood it myself. But somewhere in my poisoned, damaged mind, there was a connection between the work I'd done for 33 years and the work I was doing now. Pull the lever, take a step, stamp the component, take another step. The rhythm that had defined my life wasn't gone. It had just transformed into something new. I left her there with her companions, all of them waiting for an angel that would never come. The higher levels were abandoned. Everyone who could climb had climbed, and everyone who couldn't had died or was dying somewhere below. I moved through empty corridors where the chemical fog was thinner, not gone, never gone, but diluted enough that breathing was merely agonizing instead of impossible. I found a room that might have been a shrine once, before the collapse. The aquila had fallen from the wall and shattered on the floor, and someone had defaced the Imperial prayers with scrawled obscenities and accusations. But the room had a window, a real window, not just a crack or breach, and I went to it and looked out. The hive stretched below me, a mountain of metal and stone that was visibly crumbling even as I watched. Entire sections were sliding away, avalanches of debris that cascaded down the hive's exterior and crashed into the wastes below. Fires burned in hundreds of places, fed by ruptured promethium lines and chemical reactions I couldn't begin to understand. The toxic cloud rose from it all like steam from a kettle, mushrooming into the atmosphere, spreading its poison across the planet. How many hives were there on this world? 10? 20? Were they all collapsing too, all dying together in a synchronized failure of Imperial infrastructure? Or was ours unique, special in its destruction? I didn't know. Would never know. I turned away from the window and coughed blood onto the desecrated shrine. My vision was darkening around the edges now, tunneling down until I could only see what was directly in front of me. My legs were shaking with exhaustion and toxicity and the simple biological fact that my body had consumed everything it had left to consume and was now cannibalizing itself to stay functional. I thought about the woman on the stairs asking if I was an angel. I thought about the drill press, silent now, waiting for a worker who would never return. I thought about 33 years of service to an Imperium that had abandoned us, left us to die in darkness while it fought its eternal wars on 1,000 other fronts. And I thought, what a waste. What a colossal, senseless waste of human life and potential and hope. But thinking that was heresy, so I forced the thought away and continued climbing one step at a time, breathing poison with every inhalation, feeling my body fail by degrees. The rhythm continued. It had to continue. Because if the rhythm stopped, then what had it all been for? In a cathedral shrine embedded in the mid-hive, I found 10,000 souls packed into pews and aisles, praying with voices hoarse from weeks of constant supplication. I don't remember how I found it, or why I'd turned aside from my endless climb upward to explore a lateral corridor that seemed to lead nowhere. My mind was fragmenting by then, thoughts scattering like broken glass, memories bleeding into hallucinations until I couldn't always tell what was real and what was just my dying brain creating fantasies to comfort itself. But I must have followed some sound, perhaps the prayer chant that echoed from the cathedral's throat. Or perhaps I'd simply stumbled through the right door at the right moment through sheer random chance. The cathedral was ancient, one of those structures that predated even the oldest hab blocks around it, a relic from the Hive's founding pressed between newer construction like a fossil in sedimentary rock. Its entrance was a massive archway carved with scenes from Imperial history, the Emperor's Great Crusade, the triumph over Old Night, saints and martyrs frozen in stone, their faces worn smooth by centuries of worshipful touches. I stumbled through that archway and into a space that should have been impossible. The ceiling soared 20 meters overhead, supported by pillars that were themselves works of art, carved from what looked like real marble, not the synthetic substitutes used in modern construction, and decorated with gilt and precious metals that caught what little light existed and threw it back in scatters of gold and silver. Stained glass windows that had somehow survived the collapses cast colored shadows across the assembled faithful, depicting scenes of imperial glory that seemed like sick jokes given our current situation. And the people. Emperor, preserve me, the people. They filled every available space, sitting in the ancient pews, kneeling in the aisles, pressed against the walls, packed so tightly in some areas that they couldn't have moved if they'd wanted to. 10,000 I'd estimated, though it might have been more. 10,000 people who had found this place and decided that if they were going to die, they would die in prayer, surrounded by the symbols of their faith, calling out to the Emperor for salvation that grew more unlikely with every passing moment. The sound they made was overwhelming, not chaotic but unified, a sustained hymn that rose and fell like breathing. They were singing the hymn of the faithful servant, a prayer I'd learned as a child and repeated at mandatory devotions throughout my life. The words came automatically to my lips, muscle memory taking over. We are but dust in his sight, grains of sand upon his shore, yet each grain knows its purpose, each serves according to his law. My voice was a broken rasp that added nothing to the cathedral's chorus, but I sang anyway because what else could I do? I'd come here to this place, and the prayer was happening, and to stand silent seemed like a greater heresy than any doubt I might harbor in my poisoned heart. The priests led the litany from the altar at the cathedral's far end. There were 6 of them dressed in ceremonial robes that were stained and torn but still recognizable as the raiment of the ecclesiarchy. They held their arms aloft in supplication, their voices amplified by the cathedral's acoustics, leading the faithful through prayer after prayer after prayer without pause or rest. I worked my way through the crowd, pushing gently past people who were too focused on their devotions to object to my passage. Their faces were uniformly gaunt, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. They'd been here for days, maybe weeks, sustained by faith alone because there was no food, no water, no physical sustenance available. They were dying as they prayed, their bodies giving out even as their spirits soared in desperate hope. I found a space against one of the pillars and collapsed there, my legs finally giving out entirely. The stone was cool against my back, a small mercy in the oppressive heat of so many bodies packed so tightly together. I closed my eyes and let the prayer wash over me, the familiar words a balm against the horror of everything I'd witnessed. We ask not for comfort in our trials. We ask not for ease in our service. We ask only that our suffering have meaning, that our deaths serve His purpose. Did our suffering have meaning? Did our deaths serve any purpose beyond adding to the statistical tally of Imperial casualties? I wanted to believe it did, had spent 33 years believing without question that my small life, my insignificant contribution was part of something larger and more important. That the components I'd stamped at my drill press had gone into some machine or weapon or device that furthered humanity's survival against a hostile universe. But looking at the 10,000 dying faithful around me, I found that belief harder to maintain. What purpose did their deaths serve? What grand design was furthered by letting an entire Hive city collapse into ruin? How many billions had died here? 5, 10, 20. And for what? A woman nearby was praying with her children, 3 young ones who looked barely old enough to understand the words they were repeating. Their voices were high and thin, childish trebles that cut through the deeper tones of adult prayer like knife blades. The woman's hands rested on their heads, fingers stroking hair with mechanical repetition, and I could see tears streaming down her face even as she smiled and encouraged them to pray louder, stronger, with more faith. She knew they were dying, knew she was dying, but she was giving them this final gift, the belief that it mattered, that someone was listening, that their deaths wouldn't be meaningless accidents but sacrifices accepted by the Emperor himself. I wanted to believe it too. Wanted so desperately to believe that there was purpose in this suffering, meaning in this death. But the poison in my lungs and the weakness in my limbs and the memories of everything I'd seen, the violence, the madness, the absolute breakdown of everything we'd been told was eternal and unchanging, made faith feel like a luxury I could no longer afford. The sermon began at what might have been midday, though time had no meaning in the cathedral's perpetual gloom. One of the priests, the eldest, his face a map of wrinkles and old scars, stepped forward and raised his hands for silence. The prayer song faded, replaced by an expectant hush that was somehow louder than the singing had been. "My children," the priest began, his voice cracking with age and exhaustion but still carrying authority. "We have gathered here in the Emperor's house because we know our time is short. The Hive falls, the city dies, and we die with it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Not disagreement, just acknowledgement of truth spoken plainly. Some of you may ask why. Why has this happened? What sin have we committed that the Emperor would allow such catastrophe to befall us? The priest's eyes swept across the assembled faithful, seeing everything, judging nothing. "And I tell you, we have not sinned. You have not failed. This is not punishment. This is trial." He paused, letting the words settle. "The Emperor tests us as he has tested humanity since the moment of our creation. He tests our faith, our resolve, our willingness to serve even unto death. And you, all of you, have proven yourselves worthy. You have maintained your faith in the darkest of circumstances. You have not turned to heresy or despair. You have gathered here in his house to offer your final prayers with clean hearts and pure souls. I wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that narrative that retry UA continue transformed our suffering into something noble, something chosen, something that mattered. But I'd seen too much. The cults worshipping the ruinous powers, the cannibals who'd rationalized their hunger into righteousness, the violence and madness that had consumed the Hive like a disease. We hadn't maintained our faith as a people. Only these faithful few had held on while millions around them had broken. The Emperor will not abandon us, the priest continued, his voice rising with fervor. Even now, at this moment, his angels are preparing our deliverance. The Adeptus Astartes march to our aid. The Imperial Navy gathers in orbit. Rescue ships will come, they must come. Because we are his children, and he does not forget his own. The crowd responded with renewed prayer, their voices swelling with desperate hope. They wanted to believe, needed to believe. Because if the priest was wrong, if no rescue was coming, then they would die here in this cathedral, and their faith would have purchased them nothing but a different location for their final moments. I looked at the stained glass windows, at the depicted scenes of Imperial triumph. The Emperor defeating the last of the techno-barbarian warlords. The Great Crusade spreading across the stars. Saints performing miracles in his name. All of it was history, ancient history, events that had happened 10,000 years ago. What miracles had occurred recently? What interventions had saved the faithful in living memory? None. Or none that I knew of. The Imperium didn't work through miracles anymore. It worked through bureaucracy and military force and the grinding machinery of a galactic empire. And that machinery was slow, ponderous, more concerned with stability than individual lives. Even if they'd sent word that the Hive was collapsing, even if the distress calls had made it through the interference, how long would it take to organize a rescue? Weeks? Months? Years? We didn't have weeks. "Let us pray," the priest said, and the faithful bowed their heads. "Emperor of mankind, master of the galaxy, Lord of Terra, we beseech you in our hour of need. Send us your deliverance. Send us your mercy. Send us proof that our faith is not misplaced, that our service is not forgotten, that our suffering has meaning in your grand design. We ask this not for ourselves, but for the children among us, the innocent who have known no life but service to your Imperium. Let them see your glory. Let them witness your power. Let them know before the end that they mattered." Around me, people were weeping openly now, their faces turned upward toward the cathedral's ceiling as if they could see through stone and metal to whatever heaven lay beyond. Some held their hands out, palms up, as if expecting the Emperor to physically reach down and lift them to safety. Others clutched prayer beads or purity seals or small icons of the Aquila, their fingers working over the familiar objects with mechanical repetition. The prayer went on for hours. Different priests took turns leading different litanies, calling on different saints, recounting different miracles from Imperial history. The crowd responded with increasingly hoarse voices, their devotion never flagging even as their bodies failed. Some collapsed where they knelt, passing out from exhaustion or dehydration or simple biological failure. Others stepped forward to take their places, maintaining the unbroken chain of prayer. I tried to join them, tried to lose myself in the familiar rhythms of devotion, to find comfort in submission to something greater than myself. But my mind kept wandering, kept showing me images of everything I'd seen. The bodies, the madness, the violence, the cults, the poison, the endless collapse. And I kept thinking, where was the Emperor when the first tremor shook the Underhive? Where was he when the spire fell? Where is he now, while 10,000 of his faithful pray themselves to death in a cathedral that will soon be their tomb. A tremor shook the cathedral, stronger than any I'd felt in days. The building groaned around us, stone and metal crying out in voices that shouldn't exist. Dust rained from the ceiling. One of the stained glass windows cracked with a sound like breaking ice, spiderweb fractures spreading across a scene of the Emperor enthroned. The crowd's prayer faltered for just a moment, voices catching in collective fear. Then the priests urged them on, their voices rising in desperation. Pray harder. Show him your faith. Prove yourselves worthy of salvation. The prayer resumed, louder now, almost frantic. But I could hear the fear beneath the devotion, the creeping understanding that maybe, just maybe, no one was coming. That the Emperor's attention was elsewhere, focused on threats and wars that dwarfed our suffering. That we were expendable. Our deaths acceptable losses in a calculation so vast and complex that individual Hive cities barely registered. Another tremor, stronger still. The great Aquila that hung above the altar, a massive thing of gold and precious metals suspended by ancient chains, began to sway. I watched it swing back and forth, each arc growing wider, the chains creaking with strain that had accumulated over centuries. "The Emperor protects," the eldest priest shouted, his voice cracking with desperation now rather than faith. "He will not let his house fall. Pray, my children, pray with everything you have. Show him your devotion." But the Aquila kept swaying, momentum building, the chains groaning. I could see what was going to happen before it did, could see it as clearly as if it had already occurred. The cathedral was dying just like everything else in the Hive, and no amount of prayer would change that fact. The chain snapped with a report like a gunshot. The Aquila fell. It seemed to happen in slow motion, that massive symbol of imperial power and authority tumbling through the air, spinning, catching the light from candles and chemical lumen sticks, casting wild shadows across the upturned faces of the faithful. It crashed into the altar with the sound of the world ending, crushing stone and metal and the priests who'd been standing there leading the prayer. The impact sent shrapnel in all directions. Pieces of gold and silver, chunks of shattered stone, fragments of whatever the Aquila had been constructed from. People screamed, blood sprayed, bodies fell. The prayer stopped. In the sudden silence, broken only by moaning and the settling of debris, 10,000 people came face to face with reality. Their symbol had fallen. Their priests were dead or dying, crushed beneath the very icon they'd been exhorting the faithful to trust. The Emperor's house, his literal house, this cathedral that had stood for millennia, was coming apart around them. And no angels had appeared. No miracles had manifested. No deliverance had come. "No," someone whispered in the darkness. "No, no, no." The word spread like infection, thousands of voices taking it up. "No, no, no." I watched faith die in real time. Watched it crumble like the Aquila had crumbled, like the altar had crumbled, like everything in this emperor-forsaken city had crumbled. The faces around me transformed from devotion to despair, from hope to hopelessness, from prayer to simple animal fear. A woman near me, the one with the 3 children, had stopped crying. She sat in shock, staring at the ruined altar, at the crushed bodies of the priests, at the shattered symbol of everything she'd believed in. Her children were tugging at her robe, asking questions in frightened voices, but she didn't respond. She just stared and stared and stared until something behind her eyes simply went out. Panic rippled through the cathedral. People surged toward the exits, pushing and shoving and trampling those who couldn't move fast enough. The prayer that had unified them was gone, replaced by mindless terror. I pressed myself against the pillar, trying to avoid being crushed in the stampede, watching 10,000 faithful transform into a mob in seconds. But there was nowhere to go. The exits were too narrow to accommodate everyone at once. Bodies piled up in the doorways, creating barriers of flesh that trapped those behind. The screaming was worse than any I'd heard before. Not the screams of physical pain, but of spiritual agony, of souls breaking under the realization that they'd been abandoned. More tremors shook the cathedral. The ceiling began to crack, fissures spreading like veins across the ancient stone. Chunks of decorative carving fell, crushing those unlucky enough to be underneath. The stained glass windows shattered one by one, the depicted scenes of Imperial glory exploding into thousands of colored fragments. I watched a support pillar buckle, watched it bend and crack and finally give way with a scream of tortured stone. The section of ceiling it had been holding collapsed, bringing tons of rubble down onto the faithful below. The screaming intensified, then began to fade as those trapped under the debris suffocated or were crushed. The cathedral was collapsing. The Emperor's house was falling. I ran. Not toward the main exits. Those were death traps now, packed with desperate humanity. But toward a side door I'd noticed earlier, a servant's entrance half hidden behind a tapestry. I had to climb over bodies to reach it, had to push aside the living and step on the dead. My damaged lungs screamed with every breath, my vision tunneled to almost nothing. But some deep survival instinct drove me forward. The door was unlocked. I pushed through into a narrow corridor that smelled of incense and old stone and decay. Behind me, the cathedral's death continued, crashes and screams and the grinding sound of total structural failure. I kept moving, kept putting distance between myself and that place where faith had gone to die. I emerged into a service stairwell and immediately began climbing again, up, always up. Because down was death and staying still was death, and the only direction left was up, even though up was probably death too. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd witnessed. 10,000 people, 10,000 faithful servants of the Emperor gathered to pray for deliverance. And what had they received? Abandonment, silence, death. The priests had promised that faith would save them, that devotion would be rewarded, that suffering had meaning if you only believed hard enough, but belief hadn't stopped the Aquila from falling. Prayer hadn't held the cathedral together. Faith hadn't summoned any angels or miracles or rescue ships. We'd been forsaken, not punished. I could have accepted punishment, could have understood that we'd somehow failed and were being made to pay for our failures. But forsaken was worse. Forsaken meant that our service didn't matter, that our suffering was meaningless, that we were too insignificant to even warrant the Emperor's anger. We simply didn't register, didn't exist in any meaningful way to the vast machinery of the Imperium. I thought about 33 years of pulling the lever, stamping the component, maintaining the rhythm. 33 years of believing that my small contribution mattered, that I was part of something larger than myself. But what if it hadn't mattered? What if every component I'd stamped had simply been thrown into storage somewhere, never used, never needed, serving no purpose beyond keeping me occupied? What if my entire life had been meaningless? The heresy of that thought should have horrified me, but I was beyond horror now. I'd seen too much, survived too much, lost too much. The comfortable certainties that had structured my existence had all proven to be lies, or worse, irrelevant truths that offered no protection when protection was needed. I climbed through the service corridors, passing through spaces that had never been meant for habitation. These were the bones of the cathedral, the hidden architecture that supported the grand spaces where the faithful gathered. Pipes and cables and structural supports, all of it coated in centuries of dust and neglect. Some of it was failing now. cracking under the same stresses that were destroying everything else. In one narrow passage, I found a priest, not one of the ones from the altar. This was a younger man, maybe 30, dressed in the plain robes of a junior cleric. He was sitting with his back against the wall, his eyes open but unseeing, blood trickling from his nose and ears. Dead, or so close to it that the difference didn't matter. But as I passed, his hand shot out and grabbed my ankle with surprising strength. "Did they see?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Did the faithful see his glory before the end?" I looked down at him, at this dying priest who still believed, still hoped that some purpose had been served, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth, that the faithful had seen only death, that their final moments had been spent in terror and despair, that faith had purchased them nothing. "Yes," I lied. "They saw, they understood, they died with his name on their lips." The priest smiled, blood staining his teeth. "Good, that's good. Then it wasn't for nothing. Then they're with him now, in his presence, rewarded for their faith." He released my ankle and his head lolled to the side. Dead now, truly dead, gone to whatever afterlife he believed awaited the faithful. And maybe he was right. Maybe there was a heaven where the Emperor personally welcomed every loyal servant, where suffering was rewarded and faith was justified. But I doubted it. I doubted everything now. I left the priest's body where it lay and continued climbing, my legs shaking with exhaustion, my lungs barely functioning, my mind fragmenting into pieces that didn't quite fit together anymore. Somewhere behind me, far below, the cathedral finally collapsed entirely. I felt it through the structure, a massive settling, a definitive end. 10,000 souls buried beneath stone and metal, their prayers silenced forever, their faith unrewarded. And the universe didn't care. The Emperor didn't care. The Imperium ground on, fighting its wars, maintaining its territories, processing its billions of subjects through the machinery of eternal service. A single Hive city? A few billion dead? Acceptable losses. Regrettable but necessary. The machine would replace us with the next generation, and they would pull the levers and stamp the components and pray their prayers until they too were used up and discarded. This was the truth I'd been avoiding my entire life. We didn't matter. Our individual lives, our suffering, our deaths, none of it mattered except as statistics in an administratum ledger. We were fuel for a machine that would grind on long after we were forgotten. I climbed through the darkness, and with each step I felt my faith falling away like dead skin sloughing off to reveal something raw and angry underneath. The Emperor wasn't protecting us. He never had been. He was just a corpse on a throne, rotting for 10,000 years while his empire consumed itself in his name. And we were the faithful fools who'd believed otherwise. Chapter 8, The Final Collapse. I write this in the absolute darkness of what I believe to be the uppermost accessible level, though I can no longer be certain of anything except the certainty of death. My fingers, broken from climbing, swollen from chemical burns, barely capable of holding anything, work over the keys of a data slate I found clutched in the hands of a dead administrator. The slate's power cell is failing, its screen flickering in and out, but it still functions well enough to record these words. These final words. This confession that no one will ever read. This epitaph for a city that will never be remembered. The tremors are constant now, a sustained vibration that signals the Hive's last moments. Not the violent shaking of the early days, not the catastrophic impacts when the spire fell, but something more profound and more final. The sound of millions of tons of structure hanging in defiance of gravity, waiting for the ultimate failure that will bring it all down at once. I can feel it coming, in my bones, in my damaged lungs, in the pit of my stomach where fear has become so familiar it's indistinguishable from hunger. The city is gathering itself for one final breath, one last exhale, and then nothing. Compression, collapse, the conversion of vertical architecture into horizontal rubble, crushing everything and everyone still trapped inside. I am alone here, or perhaps surrounded by others in the dark. Without light, we have become ghosts haunting our own tomb. I haven't seen another living person in days, weeks. Time has lost all structure, all meaning. There is only before and the after is very nearly over. My lungs are ruined. Each breath is a wet, rattling wheeze that brings up blood and tissue and things I cannot name. The chemical exposure has burned me from the inside out, destroying the delicate structures that allow life to continue. I can feel fluid accumulating in my chest cavity, drowning me by degrees even as I struggle to breathe poisoned air. My vision is almost gone. Not dark. I've become accustomed to darkness, can navigate by touch and sound and the memory of spaces I've passed through. But failing, the optical nerves damaged beyond recovery, my brain no longer able to process the signals my eyes send. I see shadows and shapes and sometimes colors that shouldn't exist, hallucinations created by a dying mind trying to make sense of sensory input that no longer means anything. My mind is fracturing. I lose time now, find myself in places I don't remember traveling to. Discover that hours have passed in what felt like moments. Sometimes I hear voices, my mother's voice from childhood, the overseer's voice from the manufactorum, the voice of the drill press itself speaking in mechanical tones about rhythm and purpose and the comfort of repetition. Sometimes I have conversations with people who aren't there. The woman from Sector 17 with her lost children. The priest who died believing his flock had seen glory. The cannibal who'd rationalized murder into righteousness. They visit me in the darkness, and we talk about what we've lost and what we've learned and whether any of it mattered. The answer is always the same. No. It didn't matter, we didn't matter, our suffering was meaningless except as one more data point in the Imperium's vast accumulation of acceptable casualties. But I write this anyway. I record these words anyway. Because even though I know no one will read them, even though this data slate will be crushed along with my body when the final collapse comes, even though everything I've witnessed and endured will be forgotten as if it never happened, I need to say it, need to put it into words, need to create some record, however temporary, that we existed, that we suffered, that we died. This is my confession and my testimony. This is the truth that the Imperium doesn't want spoken, but which must be spoken anyway. We were betrayed, not by heretics or Xenos or the ruinous powers, though those exist and threaten and corrupt. We were betrayed by the very system we served, the Imperium of man that demanded our loyalty and our labor and our lives, but offered nothing in return except the promise that our suffering had meaning. That promise was a lie. I think about the components I stamped for 33 years. Where did they go? What machines did they become part of? Did they contribute to the Imperium's war effort? Or were they simply stockpiled somewhere and forgotten, made obsolete by newer designs before they were ever used? I'll never know. The Imperium doesn't tell workers like me what we're making or why. We just pull the lever and stamp the component and trust that someone somewhere knows what it's all for. But what if no one knows? What if the machine has become so vast and complex that it operates without consciousness, without purpose? Grinding on simply because stopping would require an effort no one is willing to make? What if we're all just pulling levers in the dark, creating components that serve no function, maintaining rhythms that lost their meaning millennia ago? I think about the 10,000 faithful in the cathedral, praying for deliverance that never came. They'd done everything right. maintained their faith, performed their devotions, lived according to the Lectitio Divinitatis and the Imperial Creed. And what did it earn them? Death beneath a falling Aquila, crushed in the house of the god emperor they'd served so faithfully. If faith doesn't save you, what's the point of faith? I think about the wealthy who fled in the first hours, abandoning the rest of us to die. They had the resources to save themselves, private lighters, orbital connections, the money and influence to purchase safety. And they used those resources without hesitation, without guilt, without even a moment's consideration for those they left behind. The Imperium preaches unity and common purpose and service to something greater than ourselves. But when crisis comes, it's every class for themselves. The wealthy flee, the powerful hoard resources, the military secures its own installations, and the rest of us, the workers, the faithful, the expendable masses, are left to die in whatever manner is most convenient for those above us. I think about the madness that consumed us in the final weeks. The cults, the cannibalism, the violence, the complete breakdown of everything that supposedly made us civilized. We're told that the Imperium is all that stands between humanity and chaos, that without its structure and rules and enforcement we would descend into barbarism. But the Imperium was still here, technically. Its authority still existed. Its laws were still on the books. Its symbols still decorated every wall. And yet we descended into barbarism anyway, because when people are starving and suffocating and dying in darkness, symbols and laws don't mean anything. Survival is all that remains, and survival is ugly and brutal and doesn't care about nobility or purpose. Or the Emperor's grand design. Maybe that's the real truth the Imperium doesn't want us to know. We're only civilized when civilization serves our interests. Remove the food distribution and the water reclamation and the power systems and the enforcement mechanisms, and we revert to something primal within ours. All the prayer and devotion and service, it's just a thin coating over the basic animal reality of human nature. We're not special. We're not chosen. We're not the Emperor's beloved children. We're just animals pretending to be something more. And when the pretense is stripped away, all that's left is teeth and hunger and fear. The data slate flickers again, its power failing. I don't have long now. Either the slate will die or I will, and I suspect we'll go together. Two broken machines giving out at the same moment. My fingers are broken from climbing, from clawing my way up through level after level. Always seeking higher ground, even though I knew there was no safety anywhere. The nails are torn away, the bones cracked and misaligned, the skin raw and infected. But they still work, after a fashion. Still press the keys. Still record the words. I want to curse the Emperor, want to scream my rage at the god corpse on Terra who demands everything and gives nothing. Want to denounce him and his Imperium and the lie that our suffering serves some greater purpose. But I can't. Even now, even after everything, the conditioning of a lifetime won't let me speak that final heresy. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. The Emperor watches over his faithful. These phrases are burned into my brain at a level deeper than rational thought, implanted through repetition and ritual and the threat of punishment for doubt. So instead, I'll say this. If the Emperor exists, if he truly is a god watching over humanity, then he has failed us. Failed utterly and completely. A god who cannot or will not protect his worshippers is no god at all. Just a false idol maintained through force and fear. And if he doesn't exist, if he's just a corpse on a throne kept minimally alive by machinery and sacrifice, unable to act or think or care about the trillions who pray in his name, then we're all worshipping a lie, and the Imperium is the greatest scam ever perpetrated on the human race. Either way, we're alone. We've always been alone, And everything we've been taught about service and sacrifice and faith serving a greater purpose is just a story we tell ourselves to make meaningless suffering bearable. The vibration is building now. I can feel it through the floor, through the walls, through the air itself. The hive is reaching its limit, the accumulated damage finally exceeding the structure's ability to compensate. Support structures are failing in sequence, each one transferring its load to neighbors that are already overstressed, creating a cascade of failure that spreads through the architecture like fire through dry kindling. This is it, the final moment. The end of a city that stood for 10,000 years, that housed billions across centuries, that contributed incalculable amounts of material and labor to the Imperium's endless wars. And it will fall in minutes, maybe seconds, reduced to rubble so compressed and compacted that archaeologists millennia from now, if there are archaeologists, if anyone survives, if the Imperium itself endures, won't be able to tell where one building ended and another began. It'll just be compressed matter, a mountain of worked material that was once a city, anonymous and meaningless. We'll be part of that compression. Those of us still alive, and there must be thousands, maybe tens of thousands, still clinging to existence in the upper levels, will be crushed instantly, our bodies reduced to paste, our final moments so brief we won't even have time to scream. In a way, it's mercy. Better than suffocating slowly on poison, better than starving to death in the darkness, better than going mad and eating your neighbors or worshipping false gods or simply giving up and waiting for entropy to finish its work. One instant of existence, one instant of realization, and then nothing. Oblivion. Whatever comes after death, if anything comes after death, I hope there's nothing. I hope death is just cessation, the final switching off of consciousness, dreamless sleep that never ends. Because if there's an afterlife, if we're judged for our faith and service, then I'm damned. I've lost my faith. I've doubted. I've spoken heresy in my heart, if not with my voice. I've looked at the God Emperor's works and found them wanting. But if I'm damned, then so be it. Damnation can't be worse than what I've endured. Hell can't be worse than watching a city of billions tear itself apart in the darkness. Whatever punishment awaits heretics and doubters, I'll accept it. I've earned it. My vision is completely gone now. The shadows and hallucinations have faded to uniform gray, then to nothing. I am blind in the darkness, experiencing only the vibration that grows stronger with each passing second, the wet rattle of my breathing, the fading warmth of my own body as it gives up its fight to continue. The data slate's keys are beneath my fingers. I can feel them even if I can't see them anymore. I press them by memory, by habit, maintaining the rhythm one final time. Like the drill press, like 33 years of repetition. Press the key, form the word. Press the key, form the word. The rhythm continues even as everything else fails. I can hear them now in the final moments. The voices of the dying echoing through the hive's corridors and ventilation shafts. Not screaming, we're beyond screaming now, just sounds, exhalations, final breaths, the collective death rattle of a city that has run out of time. Somewhere far below, or maybe far above, I can no longer tell direction. Something massive gives way. The sound is indescribable, beyond thunder, beyond anything the human ear evolved to process. It's the sound of finality itself, of a system reaching its absolute breaking point and shattering all at once. The floor drops beneath me, or I think it does. With no vision, no equilibrium, no reference points, I can't tell if I'm falling or if the world is falling around me. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe we're all falling together, the hive and everyone in it, dropping towards some final resting place that we'll share for eternity. My mind races through memories in the seconds that remain. Not my entire life. Consciousness doesn't work that way. Doesn't provide convenient narrative summaries at the moment of death. Just fragments, moments, sensations. My mother's hand on my head when I was very young. her voice singing a lullaby whose words I've forgotten. The first time I pulled the lever on the drill press, the satisfying crunch of metal being shaped. The overseer's grudging nod of approval. A woman I loved once, or thought I loved, whose name I can't remember but whose laugh I can still hear. The taste of real food, not corpse starch but actual food, fresh vegetables from somewhere. A gift for meeting quota 3 cycles in a row. The sweetness of it, the shock of flavor after years of bland nutrition, the first tremor, the shudder in my bones, the moment I knew, even if I couldn't admit it, that everything was ending. These moments are all I am, all I've ever been. Not a loyal servant of the Imperium, not a cog in the great machine, not a faithful worshipper of the God Emperor. Just a collection of experiences and sensations and memories stitched together into something I called self, for a few decades before the universe pulled it all apart again. The vibration reaches a crescendo. I can feel the structure around me disintegrating, feel the very molecules of rockcrete and metal beginning to separate as forces beyond their engineering tolerances tear them apart. This is it. This is the moment when the Hive stops being a city and becomes a falling mass, when architecture becomes rubble, when people become statistics. I think about the components I stamped. 33 years worth of shaped metal, each one identical to the last, each one serving some purpose I was never told. They're probably still out there somewhere in warehouses or ships or installations scattered across the Imperium. Physical evidence that I existed, that I labored, that I served. But no one will know they were mine. No one will trace them back to drill press 4206 in Manufactorum Delta 79. No one will say these components were stamped by a man whose name we don't remember, who lived and worked and died without anyone noticing. The components will outlast me. Outlast the city, outlast everyone who knew me or knew of me. They'll exist as anonymous pieces of the Imperium's vast inventory, used or unused, important or irrelevant, serving or decorating some forgotten warehouse. And that, I realize in these final seconds, is the closest thing to immortality that people like me ever achieve. Not glory or remembrance or having our names carved into monuments, just persistence. The persistence of the things we made long after we're gone. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all we get. The data slate is dying. I can feel it heating up in my hands, the power cell failing, safety systems breaking down, the device preparing to join everything else in catastrophic failure. The screen must be dark now. My words no longer being recorded, but my fingers keep pressing keys anyway. Because the rhythm demands completion. Press the key, form the word. Press the key, form the word. I think about everyone I've seen die. The family in the sealed HAB unit, choosing death by dehydration over death by violence. The faithful in the cathedral, crushed beneath their own symbols. The cannibals in the market turning necessity into sacrament, the refugees from below climbing until their bodies gave out. The priests leading prayers that went unanswered. The children, so many children who never understood why the world was ending. We all died the same death in the end. Not glorious, not meaningful. Not serving any purpose except to clear space for whoever comes next. The Imperium will replace us. This world will be repopulated or abandoned or simply forgotten, and the vast machine will grind on without pause. In the ledgers of the Administratum will be a single line item. Hive City designation, redacted, total population loss, estimated cause, structural failure, no follow-up action required, no monuments, no remembrance, no acknowledgement that billions of individual lives, each one as complex and meaningful to itself as mine was to me, ended here in darkness and despair. Just a line in a ledger, filed away and forgotten. My broken fingers find a rhythm on the dead data slate, pressing keys that no longer record anything. But the motion comforts me, connects me to 33 years of similar motion, proves that I still exist for these final moments. Pull the lever, stamp the component, press the key, form the word. The rhythm is everything. The rhythm is all that remains. I want my last thought to be something profound, some insight or revelation that makes sense of everything I've endured. But profound thoughts don't come. There's only the rhythm, the vibration, the certainty of the end approaching at the speed of falling buildings. So instead I think about the drill press. I think about the 10,000th component I stamped, identical to the 9,999 before it and the thousands that came after. I think about the satisfaction of perfect repetition, the comfort of known patterns, the simple clarity of a task that had clear beginning and ending. That's what I'll take with me into oblivion. Not faith or hope or meaning, but the memory of rhythm. The memory of work completed, of quotas met, of purposes served, even if I never understood what those purposes were. I was a good worker. That's my epitaph. That's the sum total of my existence. I pulled the lever. I stamped the component. I maintained the rhythm for 33 years until the city fell and took me with it. It's not much, but it's true. And truth is all I have left. The compression begins. I feel it before I understand it, a pressure from all directions at once, the air being forced from my lungs, my body being compacted by forces that are beyond resistance. The hive is falling inward, pancaking onto itself, millions of tons of structure occupying the same space in the same moment. This is instantaneous, they said. Too fast for the brain to register pain, too fast for consciousness to process what's happening. Just existence and then absence, with no transition between. They were wrong. There is time, not much, microseconds maybe, the final electrical impulses of a dying brain stretched to subjective eternity. But enough. Enough to feel the pressure building. Enough to understand that this is the end. Enough to have one final thought. I was a loyal servant of the Imperium, and my reward was to die unmourned in the darkness. One anonymous corpse among billions, crushed like an insect beneath the uncaring machinery of eternal war. The data slate crumbles in my hands. My bones crack, my lungs collapse, my brain